So my name is Alexander Hawkins, and I'm a pianist, composer, and I sometimes play Hammond organ as well, if people ask me nicely. We're here at Embrace Arts, where we're going to be playing in duo with Lewis Moholo, piano and drums. We've been playing together for maybe 4 or 5 years. The duo is a bit younger, maybe 2 or 3 years. We made our first record, which is out on the Ogan label, came out last year. It's called Keep Your Heart Straight, and it's a mixture of free improvisations and old South African tunes. Well, I was really lucky in that I grew up at home. My dad was a PhD student in the 60s, and he did it in England, but he took a year out in New York in 1963, so was able to hear a lot of like the real masters of the music live at that time. He'd been into the music course before then, but I was lucky in that I grew up in a household where I had jazz on the whole time. And one of his big loves was Ellington. So my earliest memory, actually no, my earliest memory is getting lost in a shopping mall, but my second earliest memory is of a really early Duke Ellington tune called Saturday Night Function. So I grew up, I did jazz chronologically, which I guess nowadays is pretty rare. You know, so I grew up, I was listening to the early Ellington, and then, you know, Fletcher Henderson and Count Basie and Jimmy Lunceford and all these things. You know, the 40s Ellington, Parker, Tatum is my hero. And then from there on, you know, Monk, Bud Powell and so on. And I sort of did this chronologically. I followed it through. I just listened to the records and I thought, I wonder what comes next in the story. And then probably by about the time I was going away to university, you know, I was maybe in the 60s as it were, so you know, listening to Monk, and then I began to hear guys like Hassan and Herbie Nichols and Elmo Hope, another of my favourites, and Cecil Taylor was in some respects the natural succession from this, you know. So I heard him not as some far out avant-gardist, but as a kind of a progression from you know, the tradition in many respects. So I was listening to Cecil Taylor, and from there on I fell in love with the music of Chicago, the AACM, the Art Ensemble, Braxton, and from there, when I was leaving university, having been listening to those people, I suppose my musical head was in a space where people like Evan Parker, they were the people that I gravitated to musically. And so for me, that kind of free improvised music, if you like, was where my head was as a result of listening to the jazz tradition. And so it's around that time where I was lucky enough to meet musicians like Lowell Coxhill, Evan, as I've mentioned, and it was Evan who introduced Lewis to me. I mean, it's a culturally really loaded word, and there's lots of musicians who don't like to use it. If we take it in the positive sense, I think you know, jazz for me has always been a sort of a Creole music. It's come from everywhere. It's come from West African music. It's come from Sufi traditions. It's come from work songs. It's actually come from Scottish Methodist music, from Spanish music, from Cuban music, from Brazilian music. So for me, because jazz in New Orleans in the 20s, that the crucible of that music, it was to do with bringing together these various strands. Jazz lends itself amazingly well to this broader approach. So, for example, you know, we're tapping into a South African strand of things here, but you know, for me, I have no problem if people are tapping into a contemporary classical strand, or a hip-hop strand, or a funk strand. You know, jazz for me, because it is this Creole idea, it's an all-encompassing thing. So for me, I would say jazz is a methodology, it's a process more than a thing. You know, and of course it has this kind of central, this kind of focal instance of kind of maybe 4/4 swinging bop-derived music or whatever, and I love that too. I mean, goodness knows that I'd be a lot richer if I didn't buy so many of those Blue Note records. But so for me, it's a very inclusive idea, and of course, there's this much narrower interpretation as well. This very conservative thing. which I think for me, what's important about that is it's, in a very real sense, precisely what jazz isn't. You know, if you're now, you know, in a conservatoire trying to sound like Miles was sounding in the 60s or Lee Morgan was in the late 1950s, that's precisely what the music isn't. Right. You know, Monk loved the old piano players, but you don't hear Monk trying to sound like James B. Johnson or trying to sound like Albert Hammond. Monk sounds like Monk, and that's why it's beautiful. I mean, if I can give a slightly cliched answer to the second part, I think one of the most important things about music is realizing that, on the one hand, you need to have a degree of self-confidence in your voice, but you need to realize that you need to keep learning and keep developing. And it's, you know, very humbling to get to play with musicians like Lewis, who are, you know, generations older than me, but still pushing and still completely unhappy to coast. There's never any sense, you know, the moment is everything, and that's a really humbling lesson that you need to keep reaching, because the thing is, you know, I suppose you can get to a stage where you're making a living, you're playing enough gigs and whatever, but I think the spirit of the thing is to keep looking for something. So that's sort of my answer to the second part. The first part of that question, what's my greatest achievement? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are lots of records that I've made that I'm very proud of. I mean, you know, like, I'm a sucker for the tradition. I love listening to records, so, you know, to share a stage with someone like Lewis is a massive honour for me, you know, just because that's the jazz fan part of me as well, you know. I grew up listening to records with him. You know, I had a lot of fun playing with, say, Marshall Allen from the Sun Ra Orchestra, or Joe McPhee from the US. Evan Parker, when Evan Parker first called me, it was just honoured, and I was convinced that I wasn't ready. But then, you know, after a while you begin to think, well, you know, if they've asked me, then they know that you're going to keep your head above water. You know, you might get a sort of benign lesson along the way. So I'm not sure what my greatest achievement is, because I sort of think if you regard something as a, you know, in those terms, you're approaching it the wrong way, because you need to keep looking in a sense, you know. You know, that's an interesting question. There are lots of dynamics to making, you know, to making music. You know, there's the thrill of being part of a cog in a machine in a big band, and then there's playing a kind of medium-sized ensemble, a little bit like, you know, which is maybe more like being one of 11 in a football team, where you're influential, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. And then there's playing solo, where you're kind of the only idea generator on stage, as it were. And then, you know, the duo situation, where there's the two of you, and that's quite an intense exchange. So, you know, collaboration varies on the context. For me, it's interesting because improvisation provides a form, a way of approaching music, through which you can make music with people from different traditions to yourself. So, for example, one of the bands I tour with is led by an Ethiopian. In the course of that, we've collaborated with, for example, the Malian singer Fatoumata Diawara. We've sat in with Talib Kweli's band. We've had a Turkish darbuk player, which is the sort of frame drum. Turkish clarinetist joined us a couple of weeks ago. We were in Paris last week, and an MC joined us. You know, so collaboration is great, because, and improvisation in particular, because it provides a methodology through which you can make music with people who are not necessarily from your tradition. But, you know, the bottom line is, you know, what are labels in music, and what we're interested in is making something together, and that's why it's an important process to me, and I think to most musicians. So there's a fantastic group called Fox's Fox, which is a group with Lewis, Evan Parker, Steve Beresford and John Edwards on bass. And one time Steve was unable to play, so Evan called me. It's definitely the most nervous I've ever been on a gig, because I was really young at this time. We got on really well, the chemistry was really nice. Then a couple of months after that, I was in the audience at one of Lewis's gigs with his larger group. He saw me between sets in the audience and asked if I wanted to sit in for the second set. I said yes, because I'd have been crazy to say no. I mean, I was also crazy to say yes, because I didn't know any of the tunes. But you know, some friendly faces in the band kind of told me what to expect, and since then I've been lucky enough to do it regularly. So that's when we met, and I guess we kind of hit it off, you know. Oh yeah, well, various things. I mean, we have a few gigs with this duo, as well as a quartet with Lewis and Jason Yard and John Edwards. I've just released a solo record, so I'm doing some solo performances, hopefully in Norway later in the year, and then maybe in Italy next year. Some things. I have the third album of my ensemble coming out at the very start of next year. So there's always that. At the start of this year, I had a BBC commission for an octet piece. And we're performing that again in Cologne at the start of next year, and that features the American trumpet player Peter Evans. And we're going to record that hopefully. You know, so various things, I suppose. You know, enough to keep me out of trouble, and then this ongoing collaboration with the Ethiopian band, which is a lot of fun. This guy Mulatu Astadke, which is, you know, a very fun thing to do. So yeah, I'm lucky really, and I get to I find enough to do to kind of keep me out of trouble, as it were. Well, I mean, that varies. I mean, as you know, it's to do with, you know, some interviewers can be very verbose, some can, interviewees rather, interviewers too, which is maybe not ideal, but interviewees. For me, it's very context specific. I mean, occasionally when I do it, I have to be kind of on best behaviour because the fanboy inside me comes out. So I want to say, wow, you know, that recording you made in 1973 in Switzerland, that's amazing, and they sort of look puzzled and they're like, which one? And then if they're nice, they go, oh yeah, they pretend to remember, you know. So you know, there are lots of questions that I would like to ask as an interviewer, which are not necessarily that interesting to the audience either. So for me, you know, look, it totally depends, I've got to say. Hi, my name's Alexander Hawkins, and you're watching Leicester Jazz House TV.